Okay, welcome to the next part of my video series defending the truthfulness of the Bible. In the last video, I gave arguments for the Bible as a whole. These were bird's-eye view arguments that attempted to show the general truth of the Bible, not the truth of any part in particular. But that changes here, where I will be defending the Bible's chief event, which is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. This is because the rest of the Bible hinges on this event. If Jesus resurrected from the dead, then he is the Messiah. If he did not, then he is not who he claims to be, and Christianity is a hoax. Note that the Old Testament could still be reliable if Jesus did not resurrect, pointing to a Messiah that was obviously not Jesus. But the New Testament and the Christianity that is based on it would be false. So, we're defending the resurrection first, and we will start with the historical evidence. Before we begin, note that I show in my video titled, "Everyone Knows That They Need a Savior, the self-evident nature of the gospel, that a substitute, much like Jesus Christ, is necessary to solve the problem of sin." I would recommend watching that before one watches this, especially if one is skeptical of Christianity. Here we are answering the question of whether the resurrection of Jesus Christ was a historically likely event. Again, if one does not think that an event such as the resurrection can be examined historically because of its spiritual implications, or if they are extremely skeptical of miracle claims, then they should watch my video on the methodology, where I address many theological and philosophical objections such as this one. If one rejects their possibility outright, then they should go to my Faith versus Science series. Because in my experience, most of the arguments against the resurrection have more to do with philosophy, theology, or its implications than the historical evidence. So again, if one is skeptical of Christianity, I would encourage them to watch the methodology video. It is very important. Here I am operating from the assumption that my listener is willing to objectively consider the evidence, specifically the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection. Know that the degree of certainty in history is generally less than it is for other disciplines. This, and most of what I say here, is taken from what I have learned from other Christian apologists. But in mathematics, we use terms such as absolute, prove, certainty, or sure, because the degree of certainty in mathematics is higher than it is for history. In history, we use terms like corroborate, support, consistent with, or likely. And we can rate our conclusions from historically unlikely to historically likely, but we can never be sure. The implication of this is that one cannot prove that the resurrection happened. They can only show that it is historically likely. If one objects to this, saying that they won't believe in anything that can't be shown with certainty, go watch the methodology video. But in a nutshell, know that we believe many things without being certain of them, including many historical truths. Even in the harder sciences like chemistry or math, the research one does is oftentimes based on the research that others have done, which introduces error. And even if this is not the case, one must deal with their own error, which can never be completely ruled out. So, demanding absolute proof is impossible in any conclusion, but especially historical ones. Therefore, to say that something is historically likely means that it happened beyond a reasonable doubt, not beyond any doubt. If this is still a problem, I encourage one to follow the evidence I am about to present with an honest heart. If the resurrection did happen, I am sure that Christ is quite capable of revealing himself on a level that is far more convincing than what history can show. Philosophical matters aside, how do we come to historical conclusions? Well, it is done by selecting the most likely explanation for a given series of facts. Criteria for a strong explanation firstly include that it is plausible, meaning that it is possible. If something is not plausible, then none of the other criteria matter, even if it is an otherwise good theory. And many would reject the resurrection, not because of the other criteria, but because they don't think it is plausible for some philosophical or spiritual reason. Again, objections like these are addressed in the methodology video because they have nothing to do with the historical evidence that is presented here. The next criteria is explanatory scope. So how many of the facts does a given theory explain? The next is explanatory power. So how well does the theory explain the facts? Because we can have a theory with good explanatory scope, but not good explanatory power. Maybe it explains all of the facts, but just doesn't explain them well. Likewise, we can have a theory that explains some facts really well, but doesn't explain all of them. So both scope and power are criteria. The next is that it is not ad hoc or contrived, meaning that the theory is not adjusted after the fact to justify a pre-held belief. An example is when objectors to the resurrection say that Jesus' disciples hallucinated his post-death appearances, and a Christian will say, well, hallucinations usually do not last for 40 days. And the objector will say, well, obviously the hallucination must have been one that made them think 40 days had passed. But this adjustment to the objector's theory is made after the fact and is only done in an attempt to preserve their objection, not follow the evidence. So this is ad hoc. The next criteria is that the explanation is in accord with already accepted beliefs. So it cannot contradict something that is already deemed to be historically likely. The sixth and last criterion is that it outperforms its competing theories in the first 5 criteria. Now that we know this, let's give an example. You have a cookie jar in your kitchen that sits on the counter. You always keep this jar full and only allow it to be opened on special occasions. One day you walk into the kitchen to find that the cookie jar's lid is open, that the jar is partially empty, and that there is a new scratch on the counter. So in your mind, you come up with a list of suspects. Firstly, there is Dad, who is notorious for his huge sweet tooth. Secondly, there is a dog Rufus, who feels that he is entitled to partake of human food. And thirdly, you suspect that Big Bird flew in through the window on a pterodactyl, having trained his pterodactyl to open the jar and steal cookies for himself. Well, the first criterion is that the theory is plausible. Since pterodactyls are extinct and Big Bird exists only on Sesame Street, this would rule out Big Bird flying in on his pterodactyl. The second is explanatory scope. So which theory explains the facts? All 3 of these theories explain all the facts. However, we also have explanatory power, which is how well do they explain the facts. I think due to a lack of opposable grip and its awkward size, a pterodactyl would have a tough time opening the cookie jar and taking the cookies. But Dad definitely could have done this, and maybe the dog. But Dad would not have a reason to scratch the countertop. So right now, Rufus is looking a little guilty. But what about being ad hoc or contrived? I don't think any of these theories are, so this is a wash. However, if I, in response to the fossil evidence saying that pterodactyls are extinct, invent some conspiracy theory about how the fossils are forged, that would be ad hoc. Are all the theories in accord with accepted beliefs? Dad and Rufus are, but not Big Bird on a pterodactyl, since that would contradict the accepted belief that dinosaurs are extinct. So what is our best theory? And which one seems to outperform the competing theories on the first 5 points? I think that the dog is a leading candidate. It is plausible. Only the dog reasonably explains all 3 facts, and he explains them well. It is not ad hoc, and it is in accord with accepted beliefs. None of the other theories have this. So, with your conclusion in mind, you turn to the dog who is laying on his bed, and the look he gives you is exactly the type of look that you see in the picture. He has guilt practically written on his face, so this confirms your theory. With that in mind, let us introduce the argument for the resurrection. This part of the video draws from Gary Habermas's and Michael Licona's book on the minimal facts argument for the resurrection. Most of the remainder of this video is going to be a book review. Of course, I will add bits and pieces here and there, such as some of the answers to objections, especially at the end, and some of the data analysis. But the foundation is Habermas's and Licona's research. I did not feel that it was necessary to conduct independent research of my own that others have already done. But in it, Habermas and Licona present 4 minimal facts surrounding the death of Jesus that the vast majority of scholars, both Christian and secular, accept. It follows that any theory attempting to explain the resurrection needs to explain these minimal facts. Fact number 1 is that Jesus died by crucifixion. Fact number 2 is that the apostles believed that Jesus rose and appeared to them. Fact number 3 is that the church persecutor Paul was suddenly changed. Fact number 4 is that the skeptic James, the brother of Jesus, was suddenly changed. And fact number 5, which is technically not a minimal fact, since it is only accepted by about 75% of scholars, is that the tomb was empty. I think that 75% is a sufficient amount to still use this fact, though. The key point is that one does not have to be a Christian to accept the minimal facts. These are agreed upon even from a secular perspective, as we will see. And the conclusion is that the resurrection of Christ is the best explanation of these facts by far, meaning that we have an argument for his deity that does not depend on the Bible. But first, let us evidence each fact. Fact number 1 is that Jesus died by crucifixion. This is mentioned directly by the Jewish historian Josephus, and since he was Jewish, he was not necessarily friendly to the idea of Jesus being the Messiah, so he would have no incentive to make this up. The Roman historian Tacitus mentions that Christus, meaning Christ, was crucified. Lucian, who is a Syrian satirist, said that the Christians worship a man who founded their rites and was crucified. This can only reasonably be Jesus. Mara bar Serapion, who was a philosopher, wrote a letter to his son while in prison, which is dated sometime in the 1st to 3rd centuries, and he said, "What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished." Wise king is a bit ambiguous, but we know that the Jews executed this king. How many kings of theirs did the Jews execute? Not many, and we know that shortly after this their kingdom was abolished, referring to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 by the Romans, and Jesus was executed by them around AD 33. So Jesus' crucifixion is the only reasonable explanation. Then we have the Talmud, which is a compilation of Jewish law and tradition compiled in the 3rd to 6th centuries, which says that on the eve of Passover, Yeshu, referring to Jesus, was hanged, and hanged means crucifixion. The Talmud is elsewhere known for its hostility toward Christianity, which makes this admission unlikely to be false. Again, one does not have to believe in the Bible's truth to accept the minimal facts. Fact number 2 is that the apostles believed that Jesus rose and appeared to them. Part 1 of defending this is that the apostles claimed Jesus' resurrection. This is seen in the Apostle Paul's letter to 1 Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians 15, 4-7, Paul states that Jesus was resurrected from the dead and that he appeared to many people, including the apostles, James, and himself. And in verse 11, he says, "Whether then it was I or they, so we preach, and so you believed." And he says, "We preach." Who is we? It only makes sense if we read the chapter that he is referring to the other people that Christ appeared to, including the apostles. And he says that we preach. Preach what? This refers to the gospel, which includes Jesus' resurrection and post-death appearances. Note that one does not have to believe in the general truth of the Bible to accept Paul's testimony. Many New Testament scholars treat this in a purely historical manner and are themselves not Christian. Next, we have oral tradition, a prime example of which is the Apostolic Creed cited in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5. We also see it in various sermon summaries. And we have written tradition. This includes the 4 gospel accounts, all of which record Jesus' resurrection and post-death appearances. And again, I am only treating the gospel accounts in a historical manner. Besides, the church fathers Clement and Polycarp also reported this. Clement wrote to the church in Corinth around AD 95, saying that the apostles went with the Holy Spirit's certainty, preaching the good news that the kingdom of God is about to come. Polycarp likewise affirmed this. So we know that the apostles claimed Jesus' resurrection. Did they actually believe what they said, or were they making it up? Well, evidence from 7 ancient sources attest of the apostles' willingness to suffer and even die for their claims. This is strong evidence that they believed what they said, because no one dies for something that they think is false. Source number 1 is the book of Acts, in which Luke records that James was martyred by King Herod. The church father Clement mentions the sufferings and probably the martyrdoms of the apostles Peter and Paul. The church father Polycarp mentions the unlimited endurance of a bunch of sufferers, including the apostle Paul. The church father Ignatius speaks of the apostles seeing and handling Jesus' body and how that encouraged them to preach the message fearlessly, even unto death. There is also Dionysius, who said something similar. He lived in the 1st century and was the first bishop of Athens. Tertullian says that the apostles Peter and Paul were martyred, and that if one doesn't believe the Christian records, to go look at the public records of Rome. These records of Rome have not been found, but for him to challenge his readers to do this in a time where they probably did have access to Rome's public records is strong evidence that his claim was legitimate. No good liar would make their claim falsifiable. And the church father Origen says that the disciples were the first to manifest their disregard for death's terrors. Elsewhere, he mentions that Peter was crucified upside down and that Paul was martyred in Rome under Nero. He also cites people who said that James was martyred. By historical standards for ancient history, the number of sources that Habermas and Licona cited is very good. So, we have strong historical evidence that the apostles of Jesus both claimed and believed that Jesus rose and appeared to them. One might object, saying that most of the sources I mentioned are Christian, implying that they have a conflict of interest. But what motive would these church fathers have had to fraudulently make up such information? Some of them were martyred themselves, or were at least risking persecution. And if they did not make it up, then they genuinely believed it, which is historical evidence that it actually happened. But one might say, then why are there no non-Christian mentions of Jesus appearing to the disciples? Well, what value would non-Christians have placed in such a fact? The idea that Jesus, who was an influential leader, was crucified would have been noted even by non-Christians because his influence as a potential political leader and insurrectionist had secular value. But this is not the case for him appearing to the apostles. To non-Christians, this fact is useless and would not be noted. Others might say that Jesus is not the only figure in ancient history whose followers claimed to see him after his death. For example, figures like Romulus, the founder of Rome, apparently appeared to Julius Caesar while he was on the road, much like Jesus appeared to Paul on the road to Damascus, or to the disciples on the road to Emmaus. And to be clear, I'm not necessarily against saying that Caesar saw something, or even that it was Romulus. Post-death appearances are reported quite often to a degree that it should not be ignored. However, the difference between these and what the apostles reported is that the apostles were in a much better position to actually interpret their experience. They had been close followers of Jesus for about 3.5 years. They knew what he looked like and were quite familiar with his teachings. And it wasn't a transitory experience. It lasted 40 days, involving all 5 senses, convincing them to lay down their lives for the risen Messiah. Furthermore, the historical documentation of this event is excellent by historical standards, something I defend in more detail in my Historical Reliability of the New Testament video. This is generally not the case in the other examples. So, I have good reason to believe the apostles' interpretation and to question some of these other interpretations, such as saying that Romulus is a god and worshiping him. In other words, if what the apostles experienced was an illusion, they would have known it, making the fact that they were willing to suffer and die all the more noteworthy. Fact number 3 is that the church persecutor Paul was suddenly changed, meaning he was converted from Judaism to Christianity. Paul's conversion is recorded by Paul in the book of Galatians and by Luke in the book of Acts. There are also early Christians who reported the same thing, and Paul's suffering and martyrdom was mentioned earlier, as Paul was counted as one of the apostles. Paul writes in detail about his sufferings in some of his letters, which Luke corroborates in the book of Acts. Again, I do not have to be a Christian to believe what it says about Paul suffering for his faith. The 4th fact is that the skeptic James, the brother of Jesus, was suddenly changed. James's conversion is broken into 3 parts. His initial state of unbelief is recorded in the gospel accounts, which says that Jesus's brothers were unbelievers and in fact criticized him for his ministry. Then there is Jesus' appearance to James, which is recorded in the creed cited in 1 Corinthians 15, and his final state is recorded in Paul's letters and in the book of Acts, both of which identify James as a leader within the Christian church. Then we have James's suffering and martyrdom, which is attested to by the Jewish historian Josephus, as well as by Hegesippus and Clement of Alexandria, who is a church father. Again, I do not have to be a Christian to accept the minimal facts. There are many secular historians who use the Bible purely for its historical claims. To throw out a historical document with the integrity of the Bible purely because of its implications is biased, a point that I defend in more detail in my video on the historical reliability of the gospel accounts. For additional evidence concerning the suffering and martyrdom of the apostles, read Sean McDowell's book titled The Fate of the Apostles. This gives strong historical evidence for the martyrdom of Peter, James, and Paul. It is commonly stated that all of the apostles except John were martyred for their faith. That is not the case, as strong evidence only exists for Peter, James, and Paul. This is not to say that the others weren't martyred, just that there is not enough evidence to conclusively say that they were martyred. Okay, so fact number 5 is that Jesus' tomb was empty. Again, this is not a true minimal fact, as only about 75% of New Testament scholars accept this. But I still think that is enough to use it to argue from. The first reason for this is called the Jerusalem factor by Habermas, and says that the body of Jesus was never produced. That is, all the enemies of Christianity had to do to disprove the apostles' claims was to produce the body of Jesus. But there is no mention of this in history. A common objection is that the body would have been unrecognizable after 50 days, which was the time between Jesus' death and when the apostles first claimed his resurrection publicly. This objection is answered by the fact that Jesus lived in an arid climate, a desert, that would have preserved bodies for that length of time. Besides, his body was prepared according to Jewish custom, being wrapped in linens and spices that would have preserved his body. And I think any corpse, even a disintegrated corpse, would have done the trick for the enemies of Christianity, because even a disintegrated corpse is still recognizable. And the fact that there was no response from the apologists of the early church indicates that the enemies of Christianity never claimed to have found Jesus' body, which they most certainly would have claimed had they found Jesus' body. Speaking of which, the second evidence for the event that Jesus' tomb was empty is that no enemy tried claiming that Jesus was still in the tomb. If the enemies had found his body, they most certainly would have claimed this, but they didn't. Is this an argument from silence? Maybe we just have to find the historical record that records people making this objection. Technically, it is an argument from silence, but given the likelihood of such a claim had they found his body, the silence is not a problem. In other words, given the number of documents we have of the early church and the likelihood of them making a claim had they found it, the fact that we have no document recording this is moderate evidence that the tomb was empty. Add to this the fact that women are recorded to have been the first witnesses of Jesus' resurrection, and this was in a time where women's testimony was generally disregarded. So the fact that women are recorded as the first witnesses would have made any skeptic of Christianity more likely to check the tomb to see if it was, in fact, empty. This raises the likelihood that if the tomb was still occupied by Jesus, that we would have heard of it. One might object, saying that it was unlikely that Jesus was even buried in the first place, making the empty tomb an unexpected, not supernatural event. For evidence, they would say that the Romans commonly left crucifixion victims out to decompose in order to make an example of them. But I think the gospel accounts answer this. They say that Joseph of Arimathea had to get explicit permission from Pontius Pilate to take Jesus' body down, indicating that although it was not common practice, that Pilate granted Joseph an exception. If one accepts the basic historical reliability of the gospel accounts, which I defend in my video series on the topic, then they have been answered. In any case, one does not have to accept fact number 5 to accept the resurrection, as we will see. Again, one does not have to be a Christian to accept the minimal facts. Going forward, any theory attempting to explain the resurrection needs to explain these minimal facts, which are that Jesus died by crucifixion, that the apostles proclaimed and believed that Jesus rose, that Paul and James were converted to Christianity, and that the tomb was empty. So what are these theories? Well, firstly, we have the apparent death theory, which says that Jesus only appeared to die, and that he was put in his tomb still alive. Somehow, he revived in the 3 days he was in the tomb, at which point he escaped, traveled to where the disciples were, and revealed himself to them. It is also implied in this theory that either Jesus or the disciples, or both, lied about there being an actual resurrection. Next, we have the theft theory, which is that the disciples stole Jesus' body and claimed that he had risen from the dead, using the empty tomb as evidence. And they presumably disposed of Jesus' body somewhere where others couldn't find it. Another variation of the theft theory is that others who weren't the disciples stole Jesus' body, and his disciples mistakenly assumed that Jesus had resurrected because his tomb was empty. Then we have the hallucination theory, which is that Jesus' disciples hallucinated his post-death appearances. This theory is popular because, on the surface, it explains one of the more difficult facts for skeptics surrounding Jesus' death, which is the disciples' genuine belief in martyrdom. Then we have the wrong tomb theory, which says that Jesus' disciples went to the wrong tomb to mourn Jesus' death. This tomb was empty, and thinking it was Jesus' tomb, they assumed that he had arisen from the dead. And lastly, we have the biblical theory, which is that Jesus resurrected from the dead. Any theory attempting to explain the resurrection needs to explain the minimal facts given earlier. Which one does this the best? Before we begin, it is important to note that Jesus' disciples were not predisposed to a belief in the resurrection, for which I will give 3 reasons. Firstly, contrary to popular belief, the Jews were not superstitious, jumping to supernatural conclusions without evidence. We can see this through the Old Testament they wrote and by their skepticism of Jesus as recorded in the Gospel accounts. One skeptic even wrote that the Jews were so superstitious that if he could go back in time, that he could convince them that he was God. The absurdity of this claim is demonstrated by the intelligence of what they wrote and by their skeptical attitudes. Secondly, a present-day bodily resurrection would have contradicted both Jewish and Greek thought, for the Jews believed in a general bodily resurrection at the end of time, but not one that would happen in their current day. And the Greeks, whose philosophies had some influence on Jewish thought, denied any bodily resurrection. Thirdly, the prevailing Jewish belief on the Messiah is that he would rescue the physical nation of Israel from physical oppressors and reign in ultimate power over the rest of the earth. Generally speaking, and this includes the disciples, they did not think that the Messiah was a spiritual savior to save them from sin, and that he had to die in order to do that. Despite passages like Isaiah 53, the idea of Jesus dying a substitutionary death was unheard of to most Jews, let alone a resurrection. Jesus' disciples demonstrate through their words, as recorded in the Gospel accounts, that they were in this category. So the disciples were not predisposed to believe in a resurrection. This is why the Bible records that they were so distraught after his death. They thought he was the Messiah, all right, but when he died, that contradicted their view of what the Messiah was supposed to do. The Messiah was supposed to save them from Rome, not get crucified. So let's start with the apparent death theory and see how many of our minimal facts it explains. Would the apparent death theory have convinced the disciples that Jesus rose from the dead? I think not. After the brutality of the crucifixion process and Jesus somehow escaping the tomb and making his way back to the disciples, he would have been in pretty bad shape. I don't think the disciples would have concluded that he rose from the dead, and they definitely would not have seen him as a savior worth dying for. And would this have convinced James, the skeptical half-brother of Jesus? No, because while the disciples were seeing Jesus, James was out doing his own thing. Somehow, Jesus would have had to have made his way to James as well and convinced him that he had risen from the dead and was God, a view that James was naturally skeptical to. What about the church persecutor Paul? He would not have been convinced for many of the same reasons as James. While the disciples were apparently seeing Jesus alive, Paul was busy being a Pharisee. Given this, he would not have taken the disciples' word for it, meaning that Jesus would have had to make his way to Paul and convince him. However, the apparent death theory does explain the empty tomb. What about the the first theft theory, saying that the disciples stole Jesus' body and lied about the resurrection. This definitely wouldn't have convinced them of his resurrection. They were the ones making it up. People die every day for beliefs that they think are true, but no one dies for a belief that they think is false. So the suffering and martyrdom of several of the apostles is a major historical fact that this theory fails to explain. And would it have convinced Paul the persecutor? No, because he was skeptical to Christianity, which is why he persecuted it. He would not have believed the disciples' fabrication. And the same goes for James, the brother of Jesus. However, this theory does explain the empty tomb, although there are many logistical problems with this that will be given later. But theoretically, this theory explains our last minimal fact. Well, what about the second theft theory, that someone else stole Jesus' body and that the disciples assumed a resurrection? This would not have convinced the disciples because, as explained earlier, they were not predisposed to a belief in a resurrection. The resurrection of Christ and the true nature of the Messiah contradicted much of their beliefs, so they were not expecting it. This is why in the gospel accounts, it wasn't the empty tomb that convinced the disciples, it was seeing Jesus. And if an empty tomb would not have even convinced those who wanted Jesus to come back, why would it have convinced skeptics like Paul and James? So this theory leaves their conversion unexplained. However, it does explain the empty tomb. Again, this is only in theory and has logistical problems. But what about hallucination theory? Would this have explained the disciples' belief in the resurrection? Yes, it would. I think its ability to explain this fact, which is not explained by any of the other naturalistic theories, is why it is so popular. But would it have explained the conversion of Paul and James? No, unless they happened to have the same hallucination around the same time, despite being in a different place and having different views of Jesus. It is far-fetched enough to say that the disciples had a common hallucinatory experience, as we will see, let alone dragging Paul and James into it. And saying that the disciples hallucinated does not explain the empty tomb. Since it was only a vision, Jesus' body would still be in the tomb. What about the wrong tomb theory? Did the disciples accidentally visit the wrong tomb and assume that Jesus had risen? Again, the disciples were not predisposed to believe in the resurrection, so this is not a conclusion that they would have jumped to. And, as explained earlier with the second theft theory, this would not have convinced the skeptics Paul and James. And it does not explain the empty tomb, because it implies that the real tomb of Jesus was still occupied, that the only empty tomb there was the one that the disciples falsely attributed to Jesus. Lastly, we have the biblical theory, which explains all four facts by saying that Jesus resurrected from the dead and appeared to the disciples, James, and Paul. So, all of the theories assume that Jesus was crucified, which is very much backed by historical evidence, and of the other three minimal facts and the empty tomb, the naturalistic theories at best explain one of them. If you are a Christian, this means that you don't need all four facts to show that the resurrection happened. For example, the conversions of James and Paul are not explained by any natural theory, and the disciples' belief that Jesus resurrected is, at best, explained by one of them. At this point, some will attempt to combine the different natural theories to explain all the facts. For example, combining hallucination theory and the theft theory explains both the disciples' beliefs and the empty tomb, but this compounds, not decreases, the error, for we are combining the problems of both theories, which I am about to describe to a greater extent. But at this point, I have adequately defended the Christian view of the resurrection using our minimal facts. The Christian should not need more than this for a debate. However, I did choose to include additional problems for each of the naturalistic theories. I italicized the bullet points that I think could be defended outside of the biblical accounts, starting with the apparent death theory. The first problem is that crucifixion was almost always a deadly process. The victim was scourged with a whip, beaten, and then nailed or hung to a wooden cross until they eventually died of suffocation. This is not something one survives. Add to this that the Romans were expert executioners. They were very good at what they did, and they were more than capable of ensuring that their victim was dead. In the biblical account, Jesus' side was pierced with a spear, which he apparently would have had to survive if he did not actually die. After that, he was basically smothered in about 75 pounds of linen and spices before he was put in the tomb. I think Jesus would have had a tough time breathing. And then Jesus, after somehow reviving himself, would have had to have rolled away the rock that was sealing the entrance to the tomb, which likely weighed many more times than he did, especially after his blood loss and likely hunger. Speaking of which, he was probably suffering from hemodynamic shock, which comes from a loss of blood due to the crucifixion process. And then he would have had to have escaped the guard that was sent to guard the tomb. Assuming that this was comprised of Roman soldiers, they were highly trained and had to face severe penalties if that which they were guarding escaped, even death. So it is likely that the Roman soldiers were guarding the tomb with their very lives, and they would not have let some carcass of a man escape unnoticed. Now there is some debate as to whether the guard was comprised of Roman soldiers or the Jewish temple guard. In either case, both groups were highly trained and would not have let this happen. Then Jesus would have had to walk around 7 miles to the village of Emmaus to appear to some of his disciples there. In his emaciated, pathetic condition, how well do you think this would have gone? At the very least, someone would have seen him hobbling down the road, probably still covered in linens because they were plastered to his skin once his blood dried, and they would have either helped him or reported him. And then we have the problem of lying. Either Jesus would have lied to his disciples about being resurrected when he wasn't, or the disciples would have had to have lied about it because it would have been clear to them that he was not actually resurrected, but had instead escaped. Based on the other accounts of Jesus, Jesus was not a liar. This would have been inconsistent with everything he taught and did, and he lacked a plausible motive for doing so. And it makes no sense to say that the disciples lied because they were willing to die for their belief that they supposedly lied about. So this is yet another problem for the apparent death theory. The minimal facts alone would have been enough to defeat it, let alone the problems I discussed here. Then we have the first theft theory. The disciples lacked the technical skills to overcome a highly trained guard of either Roman soldiers or Jewish temple police. The disciples were fishermen and businessmen, basically common people that did not have military expertise. The disciples, according to the biblical account, also lacked the courage. They were basically in hiding after Jesus' death, afraid that the same thing would happen to them since they were his followers. Add to this their dejection from thinking that they had lost a loved one, having wasted the last 3.5 years of their life on someone they thought was their Messiah but wasn't. So to say that they mustered the courage to go steal Jesus' body from a highly trained guard and risk their lives in doing so, only to spread and die for a hoax that they knew was false, is ridiculous. Furthermore, they lacked a plausible motive. They did not expect Jesus to be resurrected. So why would they have come up with this idea to say that he was resurrected? The idea was out of the question for them. And it was unpopular to Romans and Jews alike, so this would not have been an effective way to deceive people. Lastly, if the disciples stole Jesus' body and they knew it, why did none of them spill the beans while being tortured or martyred? It is said that scandals eventually come out because one person decides to spill the beans, and most of the times you don't even need to torture people to get them to do that. But somehow, none of the disciples confessed to this when they gave their lives for something they knew was a hoax. Well, what about someone else stealing the body? This too suffers from a lack of plausible motive, and it is possible that the objector could come up with a motive for whoever they thought stole the body. Like maybe there was some religious zealot out there that understood the Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah being resurrected, and they wanted to spread those views. But this is not what I see. Usually, naturalistic theories like this are spun out of pure speculation. The objector has refused to believe in the supernatural, so they will grasp at whatever natural explanation they can come up with, even if it is purely speculative. In addition, the Bible goes out of its way to address the objection that someone stole the body. It is almost as if whoever wrote Scripture knew what kind of theories people would come up with. It says that the religious leaders of the Jews bribed the soldiers to say that the disciples had stolen the body, telling them that they would keep them out of trouble with the governor, referring to Pontius Pilate, because of the inevitable punishment that would result from failing at their duty. Then we have the hallucination theory. One of the most fundamental problems with this is that the disciples, as explained earlier, were not expecting Jesus to rise from the dead. When people hallucinate, they usually hallucinate something that they expect, or at least subconsciously expect. But the disciples did not expect this even subconsciously. It contradicted their theology. On the same note, Jesus did unexpected things, such as restore Peter, eat a piece of broiled fish, and ascend to heaven. So, how could a figment of the disciples' imagination do something that they had never imagined? One might cite the modern instances where people have claimed to see their loved one after death, saying that post-death hallucinations still happen in spite of knowing that they can't come back. But do we know that these indeed were hallucinations? I am not validating their entire experience, but I do think that if someone hallucinates something they don't expect, that we should consider that more strongly. Moving on, the hallucination involved multiple senses, including vision, hearing, and touch. For example, Jesus apparently ate a piece of broiled fish, and the disciples did not just see him do that, but they were the ones that gave the fish to him. So we have multiple senses involved, but the vast majority of hallucinatory experiences are only visual in nature. That is why 1 John 1:1 says that the apostles have seen, heard, and felt the events that they are sure of. Sight alone was not enough to convince the disciples. Thomas said that he wouldn't believe unless he put his hand in Jesus' side. And when Jesus walked on water out to the boat the disciples were in, they thought they had seen a ghost, and they were only convinced once Jesus started speaking to them. Contrary to popular opinion, the disciples were not gullible. They were, in some ways, more skeptical than we are because of their theological biases. The next problem is that group hallucinations are completely undocumented. Hallucinations are confined to the individual and are not shared as some sort of a group experience, like the disciples would have had when they all met Jesus together. There are some who would point to instances of mass hysteria as evidence that group hallucinations can happen, but hysteria is different from hallucinating. And there are some instances of hysteria where they did claim to see something, such as the miracle of the sun in Fatima, where hundreds of people claimed to see the Virgin Mary perform a miraculous sign. However, the objector assumes in instances like this that the people did not actually see anything, that it was all imagined, even when there are hundreds of eyewitnesses that say otherwise. I do not have to be a Catholic to admit that the people in the miracle of the sun likely saw something. A potential difference between this and what the apostles of Jesus claimed to see is in the source of these miracles and in their interpretation, neither of which the apostles were likely to be mistaken on. Moving on, the disciples were not an at-risk group for having hallucinations, medically speaking. Hallucinations are more common among those who have had prior hallucinations, among the elderly, among women, and among those experiencing grief. The disciples were in grief, but that is about it. They were all men and were presumably not old, and they had no history of prior hallucinations that we know of. Next, the disciples' accounts of these supposed hallucinations were almost identical. All four gospel accounts record Jesus' post-resurrection appearances, and there are no major contradictions. So somehow, this hallucination was in the same place, seeing, touching, and hearing the same events. This is unheard of, and it is unlikely that the disciples conspired to make their accounts agree, as this would have made them aware of its contradictions and resultantly unreliable nature. This hallucination apparently lasted for 40 days, which was the amount of time the disciples spent with Jesus, or it at least gave the disciples the impression that he was with them for 40 days. This again is unheard of with hallucinations. And why did no enemy of Christianity, or even the disciples for that matter, not go and check the tomb of Jesus? It seems highly likely that they would have checked, especially the enemies, so this is a major problem. The disciples of Jesus were not stupid. It is commonly thought that people who lived in ancient times were less intelligent than we are, and this is especially the case with the disciples if they can't even tell the difference between a hallucination and someone actually rising from the dead. so I think this theory suffers from an acute case of what C.S. Lewis calls chronological snobbery. But what about the wrong tomb theory? Did the disciples just go to the wrong tomb, which was empty, and mistakenly assume that Jesus had been resurrected? Besides the issues discussed earlier, according to the biblical account, the tomb was checked by multiple sources, such as Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Jesus, and the apostles Peter and John. It is unlikely that they all would have erred in the same way, all having not known where Jesus was laid, and all going to a tomb that just happened to be empty instead. Besides, Mark 15:47 records that both Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Jesus saw where Jesus was laid, which explains why in chapter 16, verse 1, they knew which tomb to go to in order to anoint Jesus' body. Surely they would have corrected the rest of the disciples when they chose the wrong tomb. Besides, no one, including no enemy of Christianity, produced the body of Jesus from his real tomb. This is a problem for the theory, given how easy it would have been for Christianity's enemies to disprove it if his body was still there, and yet there is no record of such an accusation. Note that the Bible addresses every one of the naturalistic theories. It has an uncanny way of anticipating objections that are made up to 2,000 years in the future. I will briefly summarize what we have covered. We started by introducing the nature of historical study, defining what makes a good or not good historical explanation. We said that history deals with likelihood and not with absolute proof, an important point to consider when talking with skeptics. Again, if you have a philosophical or theological objection to the resurrection, it is probably addressed in my methodology video. We then pivoted to Gary Habermas's and Michael Licona's minimal facts approach, which outlined 4 minimal facts surrounding the death of Jesus that are supported even by secular historians. These are that Jesus died of crucifixion, that the apostles were convinced that he rose from the dead, and that the skeptics James and Paul were converted. A 5th fact that is not universally agreed upon, but still has solid evidence for it, is that the tomb of Jesus was empty. I then introduced the competing explanations for Jesus' resurrection, such as the apparent death theory, the 2 versions of the theft theory, the hallucination theory, wrong tomb theory, and the biblical resurrection. I showed that only Jesus rising from the dead even comes close to explaining the minimal facts, and although I did use church history and the Bible to defend some of these points, one does not have to be a Christian to believe these. There are many secular scholars who use the Bible purely for its historical or literary value. I then presented additional problems for each naturalistic theory. However, these were unnecessary to prove Habermas's and Licona's point. At this point, one may object, saying, why isn't the evidence more obvious? Why do we have to know about all these facts about history in order to know that Jesus was raised from the dead? Shouldn't God reveal himself to us more plainly? But this is a distraction, for it has more to do with how the objector thinks that God is supposed to reveal himself than with the fact that he has revealed himself. Refusing to follow the evidence because it leads to a God whose ways we don't fully understand is inappropriate, not to mention presumptuous. I would suggest following the evidence where it leads and letting God handle the people who don't have access to it. Perhaps he will reveal himself to them in a different way. Moving on, since most modern-day skeptics cannot naturally explain the events surrounding Easter Sunday, they usually take the philosophical route, saying things like, but there might be a natural explanation for these events in the future. Just because we don't have one now doesn't mean that there always won't be one. You are committing the God of the gaps fallacy. And they would cite the number of times throughout history people have thought that God was responsible for something when in reality the event is explained naturally. And they would say it's just a matter of time before science explains what we now explain with religion. And this objection, if valid, would rightfully allow the objector to dismiss just about any amount of historical evidence for the resurrection. For no matter how convincing the evidence is, I am willing to bet that people have been convinced to that extent before, only to have their phenomena explained by science. For this reason, I address objections like this in more detail in Part 3 of my Faith versus Science series. Some points, most of which are not found in that video, are as follows. Firstly, in its pure form, this objection is non-falsifiable, meaning that it cannot be proven false. For no matter how strong the evidence for a supernatural event is, the objector could always say, well, it just appears that way, but science will explain that eventually. So the skeptic, if they want to practice good science, needs to define exactly how much evidence will be enough for them to believe in the supernatural. To see why these methods are not fair to the Christian, imagine if the roles were reversed. Imagine if the skeptic, theoretically speaking, had scientific evidence that it was a common occurrence for groups of people to have the same hallucination that entail all 5 senses occurring over an extended period of time, convincing them to lay down their lives for the person in it. And let's say that these were very common in middle-aged males undergoing grief. Now, none of this is true, but I am speaking theoretically. And imagine if the Christian, instead of addressing this evidence, merely said, well, look at the number of times throughout history when people have thought that science or history or archaeology contradicted the Bible, only to be corrected by a new discovery. So it's only a matter of time before the Bible explains what you now think is explained with science. And that is true, by the way. The Bible has survived quite a few attacks over the years. But would this fly? No, for in most skeptics' minds, the Christian is ignoring positive evidence against the resurrection. But is that not the same method that the skeptic is using here? Because it's not merely the gap created from the absence of scientific discovery that the Christian is shoving God into. There is positive evidence that suggests, for example, that group hallucinations do not happen, let alone to the extent that the apostles of Christ testified. Therefore, suggesting a resurrection is done in the presence of scientific discovery about the human brain, not the absence of it. The Christian is not passively assuming that God explains it like they did in the Middle Ages. It is not committing a God of the gaps fallacy to follow the evidence where it leads. Sure, there is much unexplored territory in neuroscience, so maybe someday a scientific basis for group hallucinations will be discovered, but there is no indication that that will happen. To insist that science will one day explain away positive evidence to the contrary commits a science of the gaps fallacy. It is placing blind faith in science. Ironically, this faith is not scientifically explainable. In the case that the scientific basis for group hallucinations is discovered, would that not point to the supernatural all the more? Sure, some of the events around the resurrection might be explained, but the skeptic would now have to deal with a realm that allows psychological experiences to transcend space, time, and reality across groups, even to people at distant locations for extended periods of time. That, I think, would be harder to explain scientifically than the events surrounding the resurrection. But that would be no different from other scientific discoveries. In Faith versus Science Part 3, I discuss how when science manages to answer one question, that it opens up a whole host of unanswered questions. Thus, the gap in which the Christian apparently has to keep God is growing, not shrinking. The more we know, the more we realize we don't know, and that leaves plenty of room for God. In the skeptic's logic, not mine. In fact, the same scientific discoveries that the skeptic says leave no room for God are interpreted in quite the opposite manner by Christians. It's just a matter of perspective and what we choose to look at. For example, the discovery of the structure of DNA in the 1950s provided a molecular basis for evolution. On the other hand, its complexity and code-like nature became the source of a quite popular argument for design. Likewise, the same fossil record that evolutionists say proves evolution is interpreted by Christians as evidencing Noah's flood. So, not only is the gap widening, modern science is not even attempting to fill it, according to most Christians. As it is, when we have positive evidence pointing to the supernatural, we are obligated to follow that evidence where it leads, even if that is to a conclusion that we later find to be false. That is a practice in modern scientific discovery. To say that accepting a supernatural conclusion is inherently unscientific is a philosophical statement that is ironically not found in science. So we are left with following the truth where it leads. So those are a few answers to this last objection, most of which were not contained in my Faith versus Science video. But if you want even more answers, I recommend going there. I address it in such detail because it is so common. Like I said, most modern-day skeptics do not have a natural explanation for the minimal facts. That leaves their only option to be the philosophical route. Some will even admit that something crazy happened on Easter morning, but because of the anti-supernatural bias in today's academia, they will say that they don't know what that crazy event was. So we will hear this objection quite often in response to the resurrection, as well as to any argument that is offered for the supernatural. That is why I have a whole video dedicated to it in the Faith versus Science series. I will conclude with Matthew 12, 22, and 24, which record an exorcism and the Pharisees' response to it. It says, "Then a demon-oppressed man who was blind and mute was brought to him, and he healed them, so that the man spoke and saw." And in verse 24, it says, "But when the Pharisees heard it, they said, 'It is only by Beelzebul, the prince of demons, that this man casts out demons.'" So the Pharisees rejected the evidence for Jesus' deity because they had a specific view of what the Messiah would do and what he would look like, and Jesus did not fit that view. They therefore rejected him, even when there was overwhelming evidence to the contrary. To justify this, they came up with the ridiculous theory that he was actually operating under Satan's power. Likewise, many modern skeptics have a particular worldview that either excludes the supernatural entirely or treats supposed instances of it with extreme, unjustified skepticism. And this results in a rejection of Christ's resurrection, even when there is strong evidence to the contrary. To justify this, ridiculous theories like hallucination theory or theft theory will be proposed. At its core, this is precisely what Jesus dealt with. So, if you currently object to the Christian faith, I encourage you to pursue the evidence wherever it leads. If you are a Christian, I hope that the content of this video strengthened your faith and your testimony of Jesus Christ. Regardless of who you are, I look forward to seeing you in the next video, which presents another minimal facts argument for the resurrection. But this one is from the good works of Christians. I hope to see you there. That is all. Thank you for watching.